This is Dr. Doug Brown, and this is our fourth lecture. We're going to be going over the preparation steps, steps 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so this is the overview of the steps. We talked about steps 1 and 2 last week. This week we're going to be working on steps 3, 4, and 5. So let's just talk about these briefly. So the first step is to select and analyze keywords. Select and analyze keywords. So basically we're talking about word studies, and we're going to be talking about how do we study them and get at the meaning of the words, whether they're Greek or Hebrew. The fourth step is to study the grammar, syntax, and structure of the passage. And we're basically going to do that through a block study. And so I don't expect this class to replace basically 2 or 3 years of Greek or Hebrew, but it is going to be trying to analyze the basic structure of a passage, primarily looking at an English Bible, but if you can use a Greek or Hebrew Bible, that would be great. And then the next one is number 5, to write a content outline, So those are the steps we're going to be covering today. And there are chapters in your book about these things, so I think you should reference your books as well, because these will actually be very helpful for you to help you to analyze how to do these kind of steps as well. So let's first of all talk about defining keywords. And when we talk about word studies, this is something that English-only students really have a lot of great tools at your availability. I have a lot of those tools listed in your notes. I'm not going to go over them book by book in this video, but I am going to show you a little bit of how to do a word study and maybe some overall principles of how to do this. The book by Naselli also has a great chapter on word studies and maybe things to avoid, but also things to kind of look for. So first of all, words are building blocks. And the way language works, though, is that they're a cultural reflection of what people think and how they act in that culture. There's never very rarely, a one-to-one correspondence between one word and another culture. Sometimes there is, but usually, if you've ever done any translation work or learned another language, you know that it's very difficult to do a one-to-one correspondence. But the words are the building blocks. So if you think of like a pile of bricks, when you take those bricks, you can put them into an order, and you can actually build a wall. Well, that's kind of like what a paragraph is in the Bible. It's a group of words stacked together, and then you begin to actually see the thoughts of the author. But to break that down, you begin to see it word by word. And ultimately, the meaning of Scripture is affected by doing word studies. The problem that we have with this is the idea of translation. And so, I don't know, I took 2 years of Spanish. I don't really know Spanish very well, but I know there's enough differences in how they say things. There's always a way to say something in another language, but like, for example, I know if you say in English, I am hungry, in Spanish, it's basically, I have hunger. That's just one example, but in order to be a good translator, you actually have to think through how to translate metaphors, for example, or how to translate through figures of speech, how to translate just expressions or idioms that are they just wouldn't make any sense in the receptor language. So that has to do with grammar and syntax, but it really does also have to do with word meanings. And so what we're going to find out is that words have a semantic range, and when translators translate a word, they try to find a word that matches up with that semantic range and that semantic meaning in that context. And so I'm going to try to explain that in this lecture. Another really important factor in doing this is the idea of context. Context is, I would say, it doesn't determine the meaning of the word, because I do think words have meaning in and of themselves. But I do think that the context is very important, because if you have a word, let's just take the word counter, you don't know what of the 3 different possible meanings: to oppose, like in a battlefield, to counter something, to, like a countertop, or maybe like someone who actually counts numbers 1, 2, 3. How do you know which one it is unless you have a context to put it into? And so context helps us to determine what is the proper meaning of a given word. So I want to go over just a few dangers to avoid. Your textbook's going to go over a few more of these, but I just want to kind of introduce to you that there are a lot of pitfalls when using lexicons. There's a lot of pitfalls when doing word studies, that you can actually do too much with this in a way that is just, I don't know how to say it, it's just linguistically incompetent. Okay, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but this does happen a lot from the pulpit. So let's just talk a little bit. First of all, there's the word idea fallacy. Words in and of themselves don't mean ideas. A word is just that. It's a word in a context that is part of an idea. So when an author is giving a sentence, you need to see what that word looks like in the sentence to form the idea that he's making. You don't have, if the sentence has 10 words in it, you don't have 10 separate ideas lined up to each other. Even if they're theological words, you need to see how the word is being used in the context so that you can begin to understand what the author's saying. And so this is the temptation, especially with theological words, that we tend to bring a lot of baggage into and make the author say something that he may or may not be really trying to say in that context. Number 2, illegitimate totality transfer. And this is what we find out, is that a word could mean many different things. I just gave you the example of counter. Well, wouldn't that be, it would be totally illegitimate to take all 3 uses of the word counter and use them in any given context. So what we want to do is try to find the right definition so that we have the proper understanding of what the author is trying to communicate. Okay, so illegitimate totality transfers where you take all the definitions and you try to put them into any one given context. 3, the etymological fallacy. This is where we assume that the meaning of the word can be broken down by the roots of the word. Etymology is the root fallacy, or sometimes it's also known as the historical fallacy. The thing is, it does work sometimes. So like I'll take a Greek word like ekbalo. It means out or from, throw. Okay, so throw out of. And you guess what? That's exactly what it can mean in Greek. But there's other times where if you have the compounds of the word and you put them together, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the right idea. So like, for example, butterfly doesn't mean, butterfly. It's, you can get there, but it's not exactly just taking the roots of the word to be able to kind of figure it out. So that's another common fallacy that's done. Another one is called the referential fallacy. And this is where we, most often this is probably done when you actually have the wrong reference. So the way words work is they tend to have a referent in reality, or at least in the mind of the author. And if we misalign that referent or have the wrong referent in mind, then we can actually completely misunderstand what's being said. So this is sometimes where we have like foreign speakers in the United States, they say something that is completely absurd. Well, it's because we don't understand the referent that they're making, and it doesn't make any sense in English. And this happens a lot of times with missionaries too. These are great missionary stories. But here's the point. Sometimes this happens when you have figurative language versus literal language, and misunderstanding those referents can actually really obscure the meaning of the passage. On this slide, what I want to do is just kind of further explain to you what semantic range is. And so I did mention this earlier, and I want to kind of help you to understand this. So the semantic range of a word is all the different ways a word is used in different contexts. And so if you think about how a dictionary or a lexicon is put together, it's really a descriptive document on culture. So Noah Webster, what do you think he did to make his dictionary? Did he just kind of invent it? No, he observed how words were used in American culture, and he began to record them. And the more uses that he found, he would record all those. In fact, new words are being used, or being not invented, but new words are being used all the time in American culture. So about, 15 years ago, was it like the word ginormous was put into our vernacular. Why did they do that? It's because it was being used, okay? it was being used, and therefore it became a word. So that's why I say it's descriptive. It's just simply describing what's happening in that given culture. So the semantic range is just all the different ways people are using that word. And a dictionary then becomes authoritative because it supposedly has captured all of the ways that the word is being used and giving you ideas and examples of that. So I'm gonna use an example here of the word hand. Okay, very common word. How many definitions of the word hand do you think exist? Well, I've looked it up in one dictionary. I think I found 15 different definitions of the word hand. Can you imagine that? 15 different ones. Now, there is a primary definition that is what we think of when we think of the grasping organ. This is the literal physical hand at the end of your arm. It's the thing that grasps things. All right? Guess what? All the other definitions are going to be based upon that literal definition, but they all have their unique way of doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you like 10 of them. So let's just kind of walk through this. It could be a pointer on a clock. Okay, so the hand of the clock was pointing to 1. It could be that you have control, like if someone has the upper hand in a battle, you know, they have control. It could be that they have the side of someone, so like Jesus is at the right hand of God the Father. He's at his right side, okay? Or he's his right-hand man beside him. Handwriting, okay? So if you know, you're a forensic scientist and you're trying to figure out who did it, you look at the murder note and you say, this was written in a different hand. Or what do we mean by that? It's by a different handwriting style. And so therefore it's the hand. You could talk about a skill, okay? So if someone is very handy, they are skillful around the house to be able to construct things. Here's one. Let's give them a hand, okay? Let's applaud for somebody who did a good job at that event. So that, you know, what are we doing? We're using our hands to clap. A unit of measurement. If you've ever worked around a horse farm or horses, how do they measure how tall a horse is? It's by the measurement of a hand. A human hand is the measurement. And then finally here, how about a worker, or the idea of work? So you have the handyman, or the, you know, a hired hand around the farm to be able to kind of get things done. Now just think about that. I have all these different definitions of hand here. They're all based upon the grasping organ, but if we were writing something, we would hope that people would identify the proper usage of the word hand in our context so that it would actually make sense. But what would happen if we confuse that? You know, what if you know, the forensic scientist, instead of saying, you know, the note was written in a different hand, instead of saying that, someone confused that for control, or they used it for a measurement of a unit of measurement, and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. So what I'm trying to explain to you is what we call semantics. It's the way languages work, and the way translators work, and the way we need to kind of approach lexicons, okay? So in our next slide, we're going to kind of get into a little bit of the details of this. How do we do this step? Well, it can be quite easy if we know Greek or Hebrew, but it can be very difficult if we're trying to get into this from just an English-only point of view. So first of all, the first thing that I would say is determine which words need to be studied. And this could be super simple or it could be super complex. I think for your assignment, I've asked you to do 20 words, okay? But what I think you need to do is look for the theologically loaded terms. You know, find those words that have the most theological meaning. Number 2, words that are crucial to the meaning of the passage. So this could be like verbs or prepositions or connective words. Those little tiny words sometimes have a lot and bear a lot of meaning and a lot of significance in the passage. So if you were to take this word out, it would be completely change the meaning of the passage. Number 3, words that are repeated or indicate a theme in a book. So like, if you thought about joy in the book of Philippians, or, uh, like maybe like trials in the book of James, or wisdom in the book of James, or something like that. Maybe, we could look at like maybe certain titles of Jesus in the Gospels, like Son of Man, or Son of God, or Messiah. All of those things are going to be perhaps repeated ideas. Repeated things could be something that would be very important to look at. 4, words that after studying the passage are controversial. So you may study it and say, it's not that big of a deal. But then after you read a few commentaries, you're like, whoa, I didn't realize this was that big of a deal. I'm going to have to go back and look at this word, because this word is really the critical issue of how we actually understand the passage. So those are just some ideas. There's actually probably more. I have a list of maybe over 10 things to look at in my exegesis classes, but this just gets you an idea that you probably don't have time to study every word to the max. So you need to kind of be careful and use discernment into which words you think are actually deserving of the most study. So B, determine the semantic range of the term by. Okay, so what do I mean with that? In other words, find out how all the different ways that term could be used. And you could do it a couple different ways. I think you could look up the word in a concordance, not an English concordance, but I'm talking about a Greek concordance. And then what you could do is actually do your own survey in the Bible of that word. And then another great thing to do is just get out a really good Greek English lexicon and look it up, because they should tell you all the different ways that the word is used. A lexicon is basically a fancy word for dictionary. It's a Greek dictionary. Another really helpful tool is what's called a Hebrew English concordance or a Greek English concordance. And what that will do is it will chase down all of the Greek uses of that word in the New Testament, or the Hebrew uses of the word in the Old Testament. And so those are really helpful. So let's say you wanted to look up the word agape, which is love. You could find all the different uses of the word just by going to a Greek English concordance or a Hebrew English concordance. Now, I do that through software, and I'm going to try to show you that as well. I'm thinking about doing another video just as an example video for you, so that you can kind of see how I use Bible software and websites to kind of get some of these things done. C, examine the context of the word and then choose which meaning fits the context. So let's just say we had the word hand in our passage, and we know that we can use the word hand at least 10 different ways. Well, guess what? I need to look at the context of my passage and then determine which usage the author is choosing to be able to begin to understand how what hand means in my context. And so don't do the totality transfer, the semantic transfer flaw, or that fallacy. Don't take all the meanings. Don't pick the meaning that you want. Pick the meaning that best fits the context. That's really the issue of what we're trying to do. Okay. So when you look this up in a lexicon, you're going to time and take notes. And what you want to do is try to determine what is the best meaning of that passage in this context. D, double check your results with word study tools. And so this could be some commentaries, but often in a lexicon, it might even list your passage and give you that as an example of what you should be looking for. So that's another thing you can do, is just double check your work with people who probably know Greek or Hebrew better than you do. That would be really helpful for you to be able to double check those things. What you don't want to do is merely rely upon the commentaries, though. I think you need to do a little bit of your own original work here, getting into some of the lexicons when you do this. Okay? The best Greek lexicon is BDAG, Bauer, Danker, Art, and Gingrich, a Greek English lexicon. It's in your notes. The best Hebrew lexicon is Halot, Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. Another one that's acceptable, though, would be Holiday. And then another one that I like is BDB, Brown Driver Briggs. Those are all in your notes. I think that those are all acceptable lexicons that you can use. And I'll just tell you this, that using a Greek lexicon is a little bit easier, I think, than using a Hebrew lexicon for the first time. But they all can be profitable. I want to move on to our fourth step, and that is to discover the grammar, syntax, and structure of the passage. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, let me just talk a little bit about the definition of some of these terms. What is grammar? Grammar explains the function of a word in a specific context. Okay, so like I could have a noun, but is the noun functioning like the subject or the direct object? Well, grammar determines that. Syntax explains the relationship of the words in a clause to one another. So we have phrases and clauses, and this syntax is going to flesh out the relationship of what modifies what in the sentence. And then third is structure. Structure explains the relationship of the clauses to one another. So sometimes in Greek, for example, you have independent clauses, and then you have dependent clauses or subordinate clauses. And the relationship between those two is determined by the structure and syntax that you find in the passage. And so what we see when we study this out is we're going to start to see the ideas of the author fleshed out. And I'm going to kind of explain the importance of these things next. So what is the importance of grammar, syntax, and structure? I've had a lot of students over the years say to me, "Oh, I hate this. I can't believe this." But you know what? This is actually one of the most rewarding steps of the exegetical process. Why? Because God has spoken to us through the written word. Not only do we need to read the word, but in order to understand it properly, we really have to study grammar. We really have to study syntax, and then structure is fantastic for helping us to see the flow of ideas coming out of the author's quill. Whatever you think of these things, you need to change your attitude to say, I need to learn these things better so that I can become a better student of God's word. So the importance of grammar is this. It identifies how words function in your passage, the subject, predicate, object. If you don't know how the words are functioning, you really can't really understand the details of the passage. And when we talk about grammar, like in Greek and Hebrew, we're talking about morphology. So you change the ending or the beginning of the word, and that shape or the morphology of the word, when it changes, it helps to identify how it's being used. Syntax. Syntax identifies the proper relationship of words and phrases, and what this really does is it helps us to see what modifies what in the Greek sentence or in the Hebrew sentence. So modifiers are fantastic. So a very common modifier, for example, in Greek is what's called genitives. These are nouns, but we don't do that too much in English, but it's very, very common in Greek. And so to have these modifiers to define those things. If you look this up in a Wallace syntax book, there are 36 different genitives. And it just shows you the nuance and the detail that you can have when you write in the Greek language. Structure. Structure reveals the structure, or the if you want to think of it like the logic and flow of the clauses. It shows the author's flow of thought. And I really enjoy doing structural analysis of the passage. You probably have done this for a long time. If you write in your Bible, maybe you see a therefore and you circle it and you draw it back up to a previous idea. You're really looking at the structure of the passage. Whenever you have an and or a but or a rather or a than, and you notice those conjunctions, you're noticing that there is a two thoughts or three thoughts are tied together, and there's a logical flow to how they flow together. That's structure. And so Greek is what's called a hypotactic language. There's many subordinate clauses, and in order to understand the flow of thought, you have to look at the structure of the passage. So I would say this: good exposition is rooted in a belief in inspiration, right? We believe that the Word of God has to be preached, and we believe that the way the Word has been written is important, because it's inspired, okay? So if we really believe that, we need to be following the word as closely as we possibly can, details. Then good exposition depends on representing the thoughts of the author as he wrote them. I have that italicized important because I think we don't want to come to the passage with pre-ideas of what we think it is. We want the passage to kind of unfold before us. And so if we identify the proper syntax and grammar, syntax, structure of the passage, we're allowing the author to unfold his ideas as he wrote them. That's important. That's what I would say is at the very heart of what exegesis is. So how do we do this step? Well, first of all, I am a big fan of doing sentence diagramming. So on the page here, I have an example of John 1:1. Okay, so it's, in the beginning, the Word was, okay, and the Word was with God, pros ton theon, and the Word was God. Now, that's a loaded verse, but you can see there these three terse, almost like poetic type sentences back to back to back to back. And just laying it out like this helps me to see the structure and the emphasis that's being stated there. Now, I'm not going to force you to do sentence diagramming, but if you want to do that, you can. Many students have done this like in high school or in maybe junior high and know how to do sentence diagramming. It is a wonderful way to lay out the flow. Now, if you can do this in Greek or Hebrew, do it in Greek or Hebrew. If you don't have Greek or Hebrew yet, I give you permission to use a Bible of your choice, probably something more along the formal equivalent side. So ESV, New King James, New American Standard. Those would be the four options that I would recommend for doing this kind of assignment. What the focus of sentence diagramming is on every word. You have to deal with every word. Every word has a home, okay? And that's just the way sentence diagramming works. Another option, and I'm going to, again, do an example video for you this, is to do what I call block diagramming, or this is sometimes also called sentence phrasing, okay? I actually have some instructions for you in your in the module on this, and it also is in your textbooks. But what block diagramming is where you keep the sentences kind of together, and you simply show the relationship of the ideas to each other, okay, by subordinating them. And so this is another thing to do. And what this does is, instead of focusing on every word, the focus is on clauses and phrases, okay? And so it really is trying to show the relationship of ideas to each other rather than merely digging down into the grammar. Let's say you're a busy teacher or a busy pastor, this would probably be a great option for you on a weekly basis. In fact, there's very rarely do I preach or teach where I don't break the text down like this, okay? Well, a lot of exegesis books teach how to do this, and there's a whole entire commentary series, actually several commentary series that actually do this block diagramming for you to help you kind of see the flow of the passage. The newest one that I've been noticing is the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary series. Every passage is block diagrammed and phrased out so that you can begin to see it. Now, the last part of this is what I call semantic diagramming. And what semantic diagramming does is where you begin to label the relationships, okay? So, for example, in the phrase that we have here, in the beginning was the prepositional phrase in the beginning. What is it doing? Well, it's really showing the time, okay? So that would be a temporal reference. That's the relationship that it has to this. It's an adverbial prepositional phrase showing time, all right? Now, look at the next one, the next phrase. The Word was with God. Well, what is with God? It's another prepositional phrase, but what's the relationship of it? It's showing like relationship, or it could even be showing like a direction, like toward, okay, toward God. I think with God makes better sense, but my point is that I'm trying to define what that relationship is, okay? What is the phrase, the Word was? Well, you know what that is? It's just simply a declarative sentence. And so you have foundational statements and you have dependent statements, and you show those different relationships. And so I've got a handout for you. It's by Guthrie and Duvall, and it does explain how to do this a little bit, and I'm going to also explain how to do it in my example video. But what the semantic functions do is it identifies how clauses and phrases are functioning in the sentence. And I think this is one of the most profitable steps you'll find in the exegetical process, and I'm going to show you how to do it. It's actually a fantastic thing. And I would say this: until you do that, it's going to be almost impossible. Until you do these two steps, it's going to be almost impossible to move on to step number 5, which is your content outline. So step number 5 is a content outline, and I want to kind of show you how I would go about to do this and kind of define what it is. So first of all, let's talk about a definition of a content outline. A content outline is I would call it an exegetical outline that faithfully reproduces the ideas of the passage in their original context or the original historical context. We're not trying to be fancy or creative here. We're just simply trying to reproduce the ideas in kind of a structure, following the structure of the passage. So I have some subpoints here to kind of help you to think this through. Number 1, it's historical, not contemporary. So you want to use like the past tense. You want to talk about Paul and the Corinthians. You want to talk about, Matthew and what took place with Jesus and his disciples. You don't want to talk about what's happening at First Baptist Church or Faith Baptist Church or whatever the name of your church is. It's not a contemporary outline, it's a historical outline. It is unoriginal. And what I mean by that is we're not trying to be rhetorically savvy here. Don't be creative. Just try to reproduce what the text is saying. It merely explains the original meaning of the text. It doesn't try to get super theological. It doesn't try to come up with, alliteration. It doesn't try to do anything. It's just simply, if you read through the outline, it should be a faithful representation of what the text actually is saying. It follows the structure of the passage. And so when you have like a Roman numeral and then you have your big A's and ones, all of that for me is determined by the block diagram or the sentence diagram that I put together. Okay, and so the structure of the passage is going to follow that to a T. And sometimes you have to kind of massage things to make it fit into an outline per se. But for the most part, you're just simply going to be following your block diagram. If you do a good job with your block diagram, writing a content outline is really quite simple process. Okay. And then finally, it should use complete sentences or ideas. Now, occasionally, if you don't have a complete sentence, but it's an idea, technically an idea has a subject and a verb, and it makes sense. But this would be just that you have the ability to write out the idea, not simply use like rip, skip, dip. We're not trying to use cryptic words. Anyone should be able to pick up your outline and say, wow, that really nails what the text is saying. Now, what's the importance of a content outline? I'm glad you asked. First of all, it helps the exegete reproduce the ideas of the passage. Okay, so we want to try to summarize and capture the ideas of the passage in a way that is helpful to organize it. Okay, and this is what the content outline will do. Okay, number 2, it helps the exegete identify the structure of the passage. Okay, it helps the exegete identify the structure of the passage. And so, what are the big ideas? What are the smaller ideas? What are the main ideas, independent? What are the dependent ideas? And so you should be able to kind of see the flow and the structure of the passage after you've done your content outline. You distinguish the independent and dependent clauses, and you determine what modifies what in the passage. That's a big deal. I mean, that's really hard to do sometimes, but if you do a good job, then you've made some of those big choices, and you can actually begin to see the flow of the passage. So then that's really the last point here, is that it helps the exegete understand the logic and flow of the passage. So when a biblical writer writes, there's a logic to it. There's reason to it. And so we want to try to see and understand it and grasp it on the writer's terms, on the author's terms. And when I preach through a passage or teach through a passage, I have to feel comfortable that I understand how every single part of the passage fits into the flow of things. If I don't have that, I cannot I cannot step into the pulpit or the lectern. I cannot begin to exposit if I don't feel like I understand how everything fits into the flow of the total package of the passage. And so this is why a content outline is really important, because it will help you, force you, if you will, encourage you to actually deal with everything in the passage, not just some parts of it. So I have a note here. While a content outline is not a homiletical outline, it will help serve the message outline. So what I mean by that is this, is that at this point, you'd be tempted to take this outline into the classroom with you, or maybe to take this outline into the pulpit with you. But I would think that would be a grave mistake. And I'm going to explain why. But I will say this, is that I use my content outline inside my preaching outline. And I'm going to show you that tip when we get to how to actually write a message, okay? But all I'm trying to get you to realize is that we have not arrived. The content outline is simply a historical outline. If you want to kind of think of it like this, it's like when an archaeologist goes and makes a dig, all he's done is made a catalog of everything he's found. And that's what this is. It's a catalog of the passage, and very, very helpful, but it does not contemporize the text. It does not show the relevance of the passage, and therefore it's not a homiletical outline, okay? So now what I want to do on this slide is actually show you the basics of how to write a content outline, okay? How to write a content outline. So the first thing is that your outline, your content outline, is going to be based on the structure of the passage. So if you did a good job on your block diagram, you're going to be doing well on your content outline. If you did a poor job on that, then your content outline will reflect that as well. And there's been many, many times where I have to go back and edit this because I figure out the content, or, I change things, and so you need to go back and kind of revise things. It's also going to be based upon your semantic functions, okay? So the major points and minor points of your outline will follow your structure of your block diagram. B, outlining the outline wording, the wording that you actually put into your outline is going to be based on the semantic functions. In other words, what I want to see is I want to see your semantic functions carried over and used in your outline. And that will, I'm going to show you how to do that so that it actually makes more sense. But I want to see those functions showing up in your outline so that it faithfully represents what the text is communicating. Third, there is a difference between what I call historical versus timeless versus homiletical outline, okay? Donald Sanukian, in his book, Invitation to Biblical Preaching, has people do 3 outlines. A historical outline, this is what I would call the content outline, okay? Then he has people do a timeless outline, and then he has people do a homiletical outline. I'm going to kind of combine the timeless and homiletical outlines into one, so we're really going to do 2 outlines. We're going to do a content outline, which represents the meaning of the passage in kind of a past tense historical setting. And then we're going to do a contemporary outline, which is really more about the relevance of the passage. It's written in a way that it tries to show the relevance of the passage for the audience that you're preaching to or communicating to, okay? And so I just want you to kind of understand, like I said before, we have not arrived in sense that we've actually written our outline. We are just simply one further step down the line of being able to articulate the meaning of the passage at this point. Okay, so I think I look for that other video. I'm just going to show you an example video. It should be pretty short, but I'm going to show you a sample passage and show you how I put a block diagram, semantic diagram, and then content outline together. Those 3 steps really go together when we assemble them.